The police brutally assaulted a black woman right in front of her home, humiliating her in front of her husband and children. They had no idea who this woman truly was, and the consequences of their actions would be devastating. Subscribe to the channel so you do not miss new stories. And share your thoughts in the comments below. Alicia Carter, one of the top black female lawyers in the city, was driving her sleek black sedan down a quiet, tree-lined street in an upscale neighborhood. It was the neighborhood where she and her family had lived for over 5 years, filled with luxurious mansions, immaculate white fences, and neatly trimmed lawns. Every house in the area reflected the wealth, success, and status of its owners. Alicia's house, a modern, 2-story home, with large glass windows and minimalist architecture, stood on the corner, standing out among the other million-dollar homes. She had just left her law office after a long but triumphant day. Today, Alicia had won a case she had invested significant effort into, a major corruption case within the police force. A high-ranking police officer had been exposed, thanks to Alicia's determination and sharp legal expertise. This was not just a personal victory, but also a step forward in her long-standing fight to bring transparency and fairness to the legal system, where abuse of power and injustice remained all too clear. However, with every big case win, Alicia experienced mixed feelings, both joy and bitterness. She knew she could make a difference in the system, but at the same time, she realized that no matter how successful she became, she could never escape the racism embedded in society. As a black woman, Alicia always faced prejudice and discrimination. No matter how much she achieved victories in court, professional awards, and the reputation she had built could not shield her from the scrutinizing stares and suspicion of those who could not or would not accept that the black woman could be that successful. Her car glided slowly past the trees, rustling in the wind, the dim street lights reflecting off the glossy black paint. She was tired, but relieved that she was finally on her way home. Daniel, her husband, was probably waiting for her, with a book in hand in the living room, while their 2 young children, Jasmine and Elijah, were likely fast asleep upstairs after a day of school. She pictured her family gathering together over the weekend when she could set work aside and fully enjoy the happy moments with her husband and children. But then in the quiet of the evening, flashing blue and red lights from behind suddenly interrupted her thoughts. Alicia blinked, looking into the rear-view mirror, her heart suddenly racing. The bright headlights of the police car shone directly into her rear windshield, making it nearly impossible to see anything. Beyond the blinding light, the police car's emergency lights began flashing incessantly, casting strange blue and red glows over the empty road. A familiar feeling of dread washed over Alicia. a feeling she had known all too well. Though she knew she had done nothing wrong, violated no laws, Alicia could not help but feel tense whenever she saw police lights. As a black woman, she was acutely aware that her innocence would not always be recognized in the way it should be. This feeling had followed her since she was young, growing up in a society where a person's skin color could dictate how they were treated, regardless of who they were or what they had achieved. Alicia took a deep breath, trying to remain calm, as the police car stopped directly behind hers. The sound of car doors closing echoed clearly in the still night. She glanced into the rear view mirror and saw two figures approaching her car, their shadows stretching long under the streetlights. The officers, both in uniform, had their hands resting on their weapons, a typical gesture of readiness, as if she were a threat. They did not know who she was. They did not know she had just secured a crucial victory in the fight against police corruption. All they saw was a black woman in a luxury car, parked in front of an expensive home. One of the officers, a short, stocky man with a permanent skull, spoke in a cold voice. "Step out of the car." His words were not a request, but a command with an underlying threat. If she did not comply, Alicia remained calm, too used to dealing with situations like this. Although she knew she had done nothing wrong, life had taught her that staying calm was the only way to prevent escalation. She gently lowered her window and replied, her voice steady but firm, "I'm at my own home and this is my car." But the officer did not seem interested in listening. His eyes scanned the car, then Alicia, posing briefly on the house ahead. Suspicion was etched clearly on his face. In that moment, Alicia realized that no matter what she said, it would not change the situation. Their minds were already made up. Explanations, papers, or proof did not matter. All they saw was a black woman in an expensive car. And that was enough for them to make their conclusions. Alicia's heart raced as the second officer, taller and seemingly more aggressive, approached. She could sense the imminent danger in their steps, in every gesture that she had become all too familiar with after years of working on cases involving the police. The tall officer stopped beside her car, his cold face momentarily illuminated by the dim street lights. "Driver's license and registration," he said in a dry, unfriendly tone, lacking any warmth or understanding. His eyes examined Alicia as though she were a suspect, rather than a regular citizen, returning home after a long day. Alicia clearly felt the suspicion in the officer's eyes. She had faced situations like this before, not as a lawyer, but as a black woman. Someone always judged not for her actions, but for her skin color. She had known this since she was very young, when her mother taught her that to survive in this world, she always had to be cautious around the police, no matter what she did or where she was. But even with that preparation, Alicia could not help but feel the rising anxiety and fear. "All right," Alicia responded, trying to keep her tone calm. "I'll get my paperwork from the glove compartment. This is my house and this is my car." She carefully placed her hands on the steering wheel before reaching slowly toward the glove compartment. But immediately the officer barked harshly, "Stop. Keep your hands where I can see them." Alicia flinched, her hands instantly returning to the steering wheel, her eyes staring into the rear view mirror. Feeling her heart pounding in her chest, she tried not to let panic take over. But the officer's rudeness and aggression made it clear that this was not just a routine check. She could feel the suspicion and underlying racism in their behavior. "Listen," Alicia said, her voice calmer but still firm. "I'm just trying to get my license and registration. I own this car and this is my home." She emphasized each word clearly, hoping that her reasonable explanation would ease the tension. But the officer seemed unconvinced. He stepped closer, his hand still on his gun, his eyes watching Alicia's every move. As if expecting trouble, the second officer, who had been silent so far, stepped forward with a more hostile gesture. "We got a report of a stolen vehicle matching your car in the area," he said, his voice cold and firm. "Step out of the car now." Alicia felt her anger rising inside. All she wanted was to go home, where her family was waiting. This was her house, her car, and she had done nothing wrong. "This is my car," she repeated, "and I have the paperwork to prove it. There's no reason for you to treat me like this." But once again her words seemed to hold no weight. Instead of listening, the officer shouted again, "I told you to step out of the car." The sense of injustice overwhelmed Alicia, but she knew that resisting or showing her frustration would only make things worse. With extreme caution, she slowly opened the car door and stepped out, raising her hands to show that she had no intention of being a threat. However, as soon as she stepped out, the officer immediately grabbed her hand and shoved her roughly against the car, making her lose her balance and hit the side of the vehicle. "What makes you think you have the right to drive a car like this in this area?" The first officer sneered, shoving Alicia harder against the car. She could clearly hear the contempt in his voice, as if her driving an expensive car in a wealthy neighborhood was an insult to him. "You think you're special, we know your type." He continued, his gestures becoming more aggressive. "Black driving a fancy car must be trouble." In that moment, Alicia did not just feel humiliated. She was furious. She knew this had nothing to do with the so-called stolen car. This was about them not believing that a black woman like her could belong in a place like this, living a successful and prosperous life. This was blatant racial profiling that she had faced her entire life. No matter what she did to prove herself, The commotion outside alerted Daniel. Alicia's husband, he heard the loud, tense voices and immediately rushed to the door. The scene before him was shocking. His wife was being pinned against her car, with 2 officers standing nearby. Acting aggressively, Alicia. Daniel shouted, his voice filled with concern as he hurried toward them. But one of the officers turned, raising a hand to stop him. His voice stern, "Stay right there, or you'll be arrested, too." Daniel felt a surge of anger rising inside him, but he knew there was nothing he could do in this situation. He froze, his eyes full of worry, as he looked at Alicia, who was trying to remain calm. Meanwhile, from the window, Jasmine and Elijah, Alicia and Daniel's 2 young children were watching with wide, frightened eyes, confused and scared. The children could not understand what was happening, only that their mother was being treated like a criminal right in front of them. Alicia knew her children were watching, and that hurt her more than anything else. She had always tried to protect them from the harsh realities of life, but now racism and injustice were right in front of them, shattering every effort she had made to keep them safe. In that moment, the second officer grabbed Alicia's hands, handcuffing her roughly, ignoring her explanations and proof of ownership of the car. "You think you can get away with this just because you have money?" he growled, pushing Alicia to the ground. Alicia could do nothing but stay calm, knowing that any resistance would only make the situation worse. The pain Alicia felt was not just from the humiliation, but also from the helplessness of not being able to protect herself and her family from this blatant injustice. She could feel the cold, rough pavement against her cheek as she was forced down. The metal cuffs tightened around her wrists, causing pain to shoot up her arms. But it was nothing compared to the shame and helplessness she felt as she saw her husband and children witness everything. Daniel rushed forward, unable to remain silent any longer. "She has not done anything wrong. This is our home," he shouted. But one of the officers immediately turned to him with a threatening glare. "If you do not want to be arrested, go back inside the house right now." The officer barked, his hand still on his gun. Daniel clenched his fists in anger, but knew that in this situation, any move could make things worse. He stopped, took a deep breath, and forced himself to step back inside, his heart heavy with confusion and pain. Meanwhile, the cries of Jasmine and Elijah from inside the house made Alicia's heart ache. She knew her children were witnessing everything, their mother being treated like a criminal, right in front of their eyes. Elijah, the youngest, screamed from the window, his voice filled with fear. "Mommy, mommy," while Jasmine, her big, round eyes full of tears, stood silently, watching her mother handcuffed on the ground. That image hurt Alicia more than any physical pain. She had done everything to protect them, to create a safe life for them. But now everything she had built seemed to be crumbling in front of her. "This is my car and this is my home," Alicia repeated again, trying to keep her voice calm, despite the lump in her throat. "I have not done anything wrong. You're making a mistake." But her words had no effect. One of the officers pressed his knee into her back, making it impossible for her to move. "Shut up," he shouted, his voice full of brutality. "You think you're special. No one here cares who you are." Alicia bit her lip, trying to hold back tears in front of the officers. She did not want them to see her as weak. She did not want to give them any more reason to disrespect her. But what she was going through was unbearable. Not just the physical pain, but the humiliation and injustice that she knew had happened to so many black people before her. She, a successful lawyer who had spent her life fighting against injustices in the system, was now a victim of that very system. From the porch, Daniel watched helplessly as the police pulled his wife up, his eyes filled with worry and fear. "Please," he pleaded, "just check her papers. This is her car. You cannot do this." But Daniel's pleas fell on deaf ears. The two officers ignored him, continuing to drag Alicia toward their patrol car. As Alicia was pushed into the police car, she looked over at Daniel, their eyes meeting in a brief but powerful moment of silence. Her eyes said it all: the pain, the injustice, and the determination not to be defeated. She was not just being arrested in front of her family. She was being treated as though she did not deserve respect, as though she did not deserve a voice in this society, simply because of her skin color. "This is a mistake. I'm a lawyer. This is my home," Alicia shouted from inside the patrol car. But the sound of the car door slamming shut echoed on the quiet street, cutting off her words. The officer behind the wheel did not look back, did not listen. He just stared straight ahead, starting the car to drive away from the neighborhood. Meanwhile, the officer in the back seat with Alicia looked at her with cold, uncaring eyes that she felt pain, not just from the cuffs biting into her wrists, but deep in her soul. This injustice was not just about a wrongful arrest. It was symbolic of all the injustices she and many others had endured throughout their lives. She had fought to reform this system, to protect people like herself. But now that very system had turned its back on her. She was no longer Alicia Carter, the successful lawyer, the mother, the wife. She was just another black woman, misjudged because of her skin color. The patrol car slowly pulled away from the quiet street, taking Alicia with it, leaving Daniel and their two young children standing in shock outside their home. The silence and flashing lights gradually faded, but inside Alicia a storm of emotions raged on. She sat stiffly in the back seat of the police car, the handcuffs digging painfully into her wrists, making it hard for blood to circulate. But that physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional torment she was enduring. Everything had happened so fast, so unfairly, and in that moment she was not a mother, wife, or lawyer anymore. She was just another victim of racism, betrayed by the very system she had spent her career trying to reform. The atmosphere in the car was heavy and eerily quiet. Alicia glanced out the window as the familiar neighborhood faded away, replaced by the empty streets of the city at night. The streetlights cast faint glows, creating long streaks of light on the car window, as if the scene outside was blurring before her eyes. She tried to calm herself, taking deep breaths, but each breath felt heavier. Under the weight of the humiliation and pain she was experiencing, Alicia's mind swirled with questions and thoughts. She wondered if Daniel could do anything to help her. Were her children Jasmine and Elijah crying? How could they possibly understand this terrifying scene? Her mind was filled with images of their wide, innocent eyes full of fear and confusion as they watched their mother being handcuffed and taken away like a criminal. She knew that tonight would leave a deep scar on her children's hearts, and that thought made her heart attach. The patrol car pulled into the police station parking lot. The building's cold lights casting an unfeeling glow over the car. Alicia could feel the harshness of the place even before stepping inside. When the car door opened, the icy night air rushed into the car, sending a chill through her. The officer said nothing, simply opening the door and roughly pulling her out, the handcuffs still tight and painful. The second officer grabbed her arm, yanking her as if she were not a person but an object. Alicia gritted her teeth, refusing to cry out. She knew that the physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional violation she was enduring. As she was pulled through the doors into the police station, she felt as though she was being swallowed by a harsh and unjust reality, a place where justice seemed to never be on her side, or the side of people like her. The police station was cold, with harsh fluorescent lighting and the busy noise of officers working around her. Alicia was taken into a small room to process her arrest. The officer behind the desk typed on a computer, indifferent, without looking up as Alicia was pushed inside. The room smelled of cleaning chemicals, and an atmosphere of tension hung heavy in the air, as if everything here was emotionless and industrial. "We'll process the paperwork." "Sit still," one of the two officers ordered, his voice emotionless, like everything he had done that night. Alicia sat on the cold chair, her hands still tightly cuffed behind her back. Every minute that passed, her sense of injustice and anger grew stronger. She, a well-known lawyer in the city, who had fought countless cases against police misconduct, was now sitting in a police station, like a suspect. Images swirled in Alicia's mind. From the trial she had won, the articles praising her dedication to justice, to the countless times she had fought tirelessly to protect innocent people. But tonight, everything she had worked for seemed meaningless. The system she had hoped to reform was now the system that had targeted her. After what felt like an eternity, the officer behind the desk finally looked up. Staring coldly at Alicia's name, he asked, his tone flat, as though this was just another mindless procedure. In his long night of work, Alicia Carter, she said, her voice a mix of anger and determination. She was not going to let herself be easily defeated. The officer quickly typed her name into the computer, and as soon as Alicia Carter appeared on the screen, a flicker of surprise crossed his face. His eyes briefly showed recognition, but he quickly hid it behind his usual cold demeanor. Perhaps he had heard of her, about the famous cases she had worked on, about her role in fighting against police abuse of power. However, despite that recognition, the arrest process continued as if nothing had changed. Charges, the officer asked his colleague next to him. Suspicion of vehicle theft. The other officer replied nonchalantly, not bothering to hide his mockery. Alicia wanted to protest, wanted to shout that this was her car, that this was all a ridiculous mistake. But she knew it would not help now. They had made up their minds the moment they saw her. She did not belong where she lived, did not belong in the life she had worked so hard to build. All of her emotions had now condensed into one singular determination. Her fight for justice had never been clearer. Alicia was led through the cold hallways of the police station, where the fluorescent lights reflected an emotionless, sterile atmosphere. The echo of footsteps on the cold tiles made her feel even more isolated and wronged. She was led into a small cell with old, thick iron bars that gave off a sense of entrapment. The officer opened the cell door and shoved her inside. Without a second glance, the cold metal door slammed shut behind her with a sharp, cutting sound. Alicia sat down on the cold metal bench, the handcuffs finally being removed, leaving red raw marks on her wrists. She gently rubbed her wrists. The physical pain, nothing compared to the emotional and mental agony she was enduring. The cell was cold and dark, with dim light from the bulb above, casting a gloomy and suffocating atmosphere. Alicia sat there silently, her head resting against the cold brick wall. She could not believe she was in this situation. A lawyer who had fought for justice, now being detained like a criminal. A sense of powerlessness washed over her, but she also knew she could not let it defeat her. Time passed slowly. Every moment in that cell felt like an eternity. Alicia's mind could not stop racing with thoughts. Were Daniel and the kids okay? What would they do next? Her biggest worry was for her children, Jasmine and Elijah. Would they understand what had happened? Or were they scared, wondering if their mother would come back? The thought made her heart catch. She had always tried to shield them from the cruel realities of society, but now she had been the one to bring them face to face with injustice. Sitting in the cold, dark silence, Alicia could not stop thinking about the cases she had worked on. She had met so many people who had been abused by the police, wrongfully accused, simply because of the color of their skin. She had fought tirelessly to bring justice to those people, and now she was in their position, becoming a victim of the very system she had tried to change. Ironic, was not it that someone who had dedicated her life to fighting for justice was now being treated like a criminal because of prejudice and racism? These thoughts filled Alicia with both anger and frustration, but in that moment, a new fire of determination was lit inside her. She could not let this go without a fight. She would fight not just for herself, but for all the people who had been in the same situation. The humiliation and pain she had endured could not be ignored. She would ensure that justice was served, and those officers would pay for their actions. Outside the cell, the sound of officers' footsteps echoed down the hall. Everything outside seemed to go on as usual, as if detaining an innocent person was just another routine event here. Alicia closed her eyes, trying to breathe deeply and keep herself calm. She knew her fight had only just begun. From this night forward, everything would change, and she was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. Time continued to pass in silence and isolation, but Alicia did not feel defeated. Instead, in the darkness of that cell, her resolve only grew stronger. She knew that when the daylight came, she would rise not as a victim, but as someone determined to claim justice for herself and for others. She told herself this was only the first step in a long journey, and she was ready for the battles to come. Hours later, the sound of footsteps in the hallway pulled Alicia out of her thoughts. The cell door opened with a loud metallic screech. An officer stepped in holding a set of papers, his face expressionless. Carter. He called her name, his voice monotone. "You're being released." Alicia stood up slowly, her body stiff and sore from sitting for hours in the cold, cramped cell. She walked out of the cell, feeling the stinging pain on her wrists, where the cuffs had been so tight for so long. Outside, the police station was eerily quiet, as if nothing significant had happened. The officer said nothing more, simply guiding her to the processing desk. Before she could comprehend what was happening, they had completed her release paperwork, as if it were just another routine procedure. When the officer behind the desk handed back her personal belongings, her phone, wallet, and car keys, he simply said, "This is your car. The paperwork has been checked." His words were soft and emotionless, as if everything that had happened tonight was just a minor mistake, a misunderstanding not worth dwelling on. Alicia felt a surge of anger rising in her chest. They were just letting her go without an apology, without any acknowledgement that she had been wronged. To them, arresting and detaining a black woman like her was no big deal. She had become a victim of a biased system, and now they just wanted to sweep it all away, as if it had never happened. She clutched her phone tightly, trying to stay calm as she walked toward the exit. Her mind was filled with anger, but she knew that rage would not help her right now. Alicia stepped out of the police station into the quiet, late-night air, the streetlights casting a cold glow on the sidewalk, emphasizing her solitude in this moment. No apology, no explanation, nothing but cold silence. She unlocked her phone and saw messages from Daniel, his worried words lighting up the screen. "Are you okay? Did they release you? The kids are so worried." Alicia's eyes blurred momentarily as she read her husband's messages. She knew her family had been through a night of fear and tension. She quickly typed back to Daniel, "Do not worry, I'm on my way home." Alicia walked toward her car, still parked outside the police station, the very car they had used as the excuse to arrest her. She held her keys, but her hands were still trembling. As she opened the car door, the feeling of helplessness weighed on her like a heavy blanket. She was used to fighting for others, but tonight she had become the victim, and the injustice she had endured was too clear. As she sat in the driver's seat, she took a deep breath, feeling the cold air around her. Hours had passed since the police had unjustly arrested her right in front of her home. In her mind, everything still felt like a nightmare. The cruelty and indifference of those officers had shattered her faith in the system. She had dedicated her life to reforming. Alicia started the car, the engine roaring into the quiet night, but it could not erase the pain and humiliation she felt. She knew this was only the beginning of a much bigger fight, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever endured injustice because of the color of their skin. On the drive home, Alicia's mind raced with thoughts of what had happened. Her anger simmered as she replayed every detail of the arrest. They had disrespected her, ignored her dignity and rights, and it only fueled her determination. She could not let this go easily. When she finally arrived home, Daniel was waiting at the door, his face filled with worry and exhaustion. He rushed to the car when he saw her step out, wrapping his arms around her in silence, as if her presence was the only comfort he needed. In that moment, Alicia returned her husband's embrace, but her mind was still consumed with thoughts of what needed to be done next. "Are you okay?" Daniel asked, his voice hoarse from worry and staying up all night. Alicia nodded, but her eyes burned with determination. "I'm okay, but this cannot end here." They crossed the line, Daniel. I will not let them get away with this, she said, her voice full of resolve. They stepped inside the house, where the lights were still on. On the stairs, Jasmine and Elijah were sitting, their big round eyes watching their mother with concern. When they saw that their mother was safe, both children rushed to her, hugging her tightly. Mom, are you okay? Why did they take you? Jasmine asked, her voice choked with tears. Alicia knelt down, hugging both of her children. She felt a sharp pain in her heart as she explained the injustice she had faced. I'm okay, my loves. There was a misunderstanding, but I'll make sure everything is right, she said, softly, trying to keep her voice steady. She knew the kids were too young to fully understand what had happened, but they had already sensed the injustice from what they had witnessed. After tucking her children into bed, Alicia walked into her office. She sat down at her desk, her eyes staring at the phone screen, where the name of one of her most trusted colleagues appeared without hesitation. She called Mark, a fellow lawyer who had worked with her on many cases involving police misconduct. Mark, it's Alicia, she began, as his familiar voice came through on the other end. I need your help. I was just wrongfully arrested by the police right outside my home. Her voice wavered, but there was no hiding the anger and determination. They arrested me because of my skin color and the car I was driving. I will not let this go. We need to act. Mark was silent for a moment before responding, his voice filled with shock and concern. What you're telling me? The police arrested you right outside your house. This is unbelievable. I cannot believe it. Alicia quickly recounted what had happened, from being pulled out of her car, handcuffed in front of her husband and children, to being treated like a criminal for hours in the police station. Every word she spoke only made Mark's outrage grow. We will not let this go, he replied firmly. I'll help you sue them. This is a case we can use to push forward the police reform fight you've been pursuing for so long. Police, your new Mark was a reliable ally in this battle. They had worked together on numerous cases involving police misconduct, but this time it had become deeply personal. This was not just a fight for others anymore. It was a fight for herself, for her family, and for her children, who had witnessed the cruelty of injustice firsthand. What's our next step? Alicia asked, her voice full of determination. First, we need to gather all the evidence you have. Mark replied, we'll sue the police for wrongful arrest, abuse of power, and racial profiling. I'll also reach out to the media. This is a story we can use to bring more attention to the issue. Alicia fell silent for a moment, thinking about the road ahead. She knew this battle would not be easy, but she was ready for it. I will not stop until they're held accountable, she said firmly, not just for me, But for everyone who has ever suffered this kind of injustice, she hung up the phone, staring at the screen in front of her, her eyes focused. The fight for justice she had been pursuing for so long was now clearer than ever. Alicia knew she was not just fighting for herself anymore, but for everyone who had been wronged. In the days that followed, Alicia and Mark, along with their team, began gathering every piece of evidence they could. They searched for security camera footage from the neighborhood, collected statements from neighbors who had witnessed the event, and carefully documented every detail of the night. Alicia had been wrongfully arrested. Her story began to make headlines in the press and spread across social media, turning Alicia into a symbol of the fight against police abuse and racial discrimination. When the day of the first court hearing arrived, the courtroom was packed with people. Reporters, activists, and supporters of police reform were all present. Alicia sat at her table, the tension in the air palpable. She could feel the eyes of the crowd on her, and with each gaze, she sensed that they were not just there to support her, but to represent a larger struggle. Beside her stood Mark, her trusted friend and colleague, who had been with her every step of the way. They knew this trial was not just about getting justice for Alicia, but was also an opportunity to speak out for those who had been ignored by the system. Across the room, the police officers accused of misconduct sat with cold, smug expressions. They did not seem afraid of what was coming, believing that the system would protect them, as it had so many times before. The lawyers defending the officers tried to construct a narrative that the arrest was legal and that the officers had followed proper procedures. They offered familiar excuses, arguing that Alicia's car matched the description of a stolen vehicle, and that her behavior that night made them feel threatened. But when Mark stepped up to speak in court, the truth began to come to light. He presented the evidence with clear logic and strength. Security camera footage showed that Alicia had been treated unjustly, and aggressively witness testimonies, including those of her neighbors, confirmed that there had been no suspicious behavior on Alicia's part. She was simply returning home to a neighborhood she had lived in for years. Alicia sat quietly listening, but inside her emotions were swirling. She had relived every moment of that night through the stories and evidence her team had presented. But she knew the hardest part was still ahead. She had to speak for herself. When it was Alicia's turn to stand before the court, the entire room fell silent. She walked to the stand, looking directly at the jury, and began to tell her story. Every detail from that night came flooding back. But this time she was not just a victim. She was a fighter. Her voice was strong, But there was no hiding the emotion, as she spoke about the pain of being handcuffed in front of her children, about the humiliation of being treated like a criminal, simply because of her skin color. That night, Alicia said, her voice lowering, as she looked directly at the police officers, I was not just a woman coming home after a long day of work. I was a mother, a wife, and a lawyer. But to you, I was just a black woman in a luxury car. And that made you believe I did not belong, that I was a threat. She spoke about the pain of being pulled from her car, being handcuffed without reason, and being humiliated right outside her own home. But more than anything, she emphasized the injustice that she and so many others had faced for years, simply because of their skin color. When she described her children witnessing the event from the window, their innocent eyes not understanding why their mother was being treated this way, the room grew quiet, and a heavy silence fell over the court. Alicia's story touched the hearts of many in the courtroom that day. Her words were not just a personal story. They were the voice of thousands of people of color who had been discriminated against, who had endured injustices they could not speak out about. When the trial concluded, the atmosphere in the courtroom was tense with anticipation. Everyone waited anxiously for the verdict, filled with both hope and worry. Finally, after hours of deliberation, the jury delivered a verdict in Alicia's favor. The police officers were found guilty of abuse of power and racial discrimination, and the police department was held responsible for compensating Alicia and her family. It was a victory not just for Alicia, but for everyone who had faced injustice in the legal system. But Alicia knew this was just the beginning. This victory might have restored justice for her. But there were still so many people out there who needed protection, who needed a voice. As she stepped out of the courtroom, she felt the weight of the larger fight still ahead. But she was ready to keep going, not just for herself, but for everyone who needed justice. Outside the courthouse, the flashing cameras and the crowd of supporters, reporters and activists surrounded Alicia, Daniel and their children. She could feel the strong support from the community, people who had been following her case from the start. But she also knew that with this attention came an even greater responsibility. The media quickly reported on Alicia's courtroom victory, portraying her as a new symbol in the movement for police reform. She became a voice, representing thousands of people who had been wronged, and her story spread not just locally but nationally. Alicia and her family's lives were no longer the same as they faced the public's constant attention. But Alicia did not waver. She knew this fight was far from over and full of challenges, but she was prepared to face them. Television interviews, news articles, and public forums constantly invited Alicia to share her story. She stood up telling her story, not just to reclaim justice for herself, but to push for change. She spoke out, calling for reforms in the police force, emphasizing the need for retraining officers, ending discriminatory practices, and holding those who abused their power accountable. With every speech she gave, she felt the power of her voice growing, and more people rallied behind her. Daniel and their children, Jasmine and Elijah, also experienced a significant change. They had not only witnessed the injustice their mother had endured, but now they too were part of this fight. Daniel, always the loving and supportive husband, became Alicia's rock, standing by her side every step of the way. He was not just there to offer emotional support, but to help her fight for the fairness their family deserved. Alicia realized that her victory in court was not the end, but just the beginning. The fight for justice and equality was still ongoing in society, and she could not stop. She felt a greater responsibility than ever. Her life was no longer about winning or losing. In the courtroom, it was about creating lasting, meaningful change in the system she had spent her life trying to reform. One afternoon, while sitting with her family on the porch, Alicia looked out at her children playing in the yard. Daniel sat beside her, holding her hand tightly, his eyes full of pride and love. "You did it," he said softly, as if to remind her of the long journey she had come through. Alicia smiled, but she knew her journey was not over. She turned to Daniel and replied, "We did it, but there's still more to do." In that moment, she felt hope and strength surge within her. She had overcome a personal battle to stand up for her entire community. And with the strength from her family, her community, and her unwavering determination, Alicia knew she would continue fighting for justice, relentlessly, until everyone was treated fairly. Alicia Carter's story is not just the story of a lawyer who was wronged. It's a story of courage, perseverance, and a love for justice. She stood up, faced injustice, and claimed her rights. But more importantly, she inspired countless others to do the same. This journey for Alicia was not just a mission, it was her life. And so a spark of change was ignited. Shining brighter than ever, Alicia Carter's story is not just about one woman standing up against injustice. It's a symbol of resilience, determination, and faith in justice. She showed us that, no matter how flawed and discriminatory the system, maybe we have the right to speak up and reclaim fairness for ourselves and our communities. It's a lesson in bravery in the face of adversity, about love for family, and about the great responsibility of creating a fairer society. Alicia's story reminds us that change is never easy, but every step matters and every voice has power. As long as we do not give up, justice will always find its way. If you feel inspired by this story and want to follow more meaningful stories, Do not forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you do not miss the latest content. Together we can spread positive messages and contribute to building a fairer society. Thank you for supporting and following along.